It was a warm summer evening in the quiet town of Cedar Grove, Texas, a town where secrets usually stayed hidden beneath the surface, and the loudest sounds were the church bells ringing for Sunday services. The sun had just begun to set, casting an amber glow over the small, one-story houses that lined the main street. In the center of town stood the Cedar Grove Baptist Church, an old building that had been around for nearly a century. It had weathered many storms, both literal and metaphorical, and had seen generations of families come and go. Reverend Samuel Carrington had been the church's pastor for the last 15 years. He was a well-respected man, known for his fiery sermons and kind demeanor. To the members of his congregation, he was a pillar of faith, a man they looked up to, trusted, and confided in. But behind the pulpit, in the shadows, Samuel Carrington had a dark secret, a secret that would ultimately unravel everything he had worked so hard to build. The affair had started innocently enough. It was a Saturday evening, and Samuel was meeting with his wife's mother, Gladys Winters, to discuss some details about the upcoming church event. Samuel's wife, Rachel, was busy with preparations for the Sunday service and had asked her mother to help with the decorations. Gladys, a widow in her mid-60s, had always been a bit of a flirt. She had a charm that made it difficult for men to resist her, and Samuel had always been a bit too complimentary. Over time, those compliments turned into late-night conversations. The conversations became more personal, more intimate. It wasn't long before Samuel found himself drawn to her in ways that shocked even him. He tried to fight the temptation at first. He was a man of God, after all. But Gladys was persistent, and slowly, Samuel found himself unable to resist her charms. They started meeting in secret, sneaking away to motels when the town was asleep, and their affair blossomed in the dark corners of their hidden world. For months, Samuel lived a double life. On Sundays, he preached about faith, morality, and family values. The rest of the week, he was entangled in an affair with his mother-in-law. He never once considered the consequences, convinced that his secret would remain safe forever. But nothing stays hidden forever. One fateful Thursday evening, Rachel decided to stop by her mother's house after work to drop off some papers. She didn't expect to see anything out of the ordinary, but as she approached the front door, she noticed something strange. The light in the living room was on, and she could hear faint laughter from inside. It was a sound she hadn't heard in a long time. Her mother's laugh, but it wasn't the same. It was a different kind of laughter, one that made Rachel uneasy. She knocked on the door. Inside, Samuel and Gladys froze. Samuel's heart sank, and for a moment, he felt like the world had stopped turning. Gladys, ever the quick thinker, scrambled to pull herself together, but it was too late. Rachel had already seen the way Samuel was sitting on the couch, his shirt untucked, his tie loosened. She had already seen the look on her mother's face. The silence that followed was deafening. Samuel stood up quickly, his mind racing for an excuse, for anything to explain the situation. But Rachel didn't need an explanation. She had already seen enough. "I can't believe this," Rachel whispered, her voice breaking. "How could you? How could you do this to me? With my mother?" Samuel opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. His stomach churned, and for the first time in years, he felt completely powerless. He had spent so long hiding the truth, but now the truth had come crashing down like a tidal wave. Gladys stood up too, but she didn't say anything. She just looked at Rachel, her face a mixture of guilt and defiance. Samuel could see the way her eyes darted around the room, as though looking for a way out. But there was no escape. Rachel had seen it all. Rachel turned and ran out of the house, her tears streaming down her face. Samuel followed her, but by the time he reached the street, she was gone. He stood there, feeling the weight of his actions, but there was no going back. He had betrayed the one person who had trusted him more than anyone else, and now the consequences of his infidelity were just beginning to unfold. In the days that followed, Rachel refused to speak to Samuel. She packed her things and left their home, moving into her childhood house with her mother. Samuel tried calling her, but she never answered. The guilt gnawed at him, but there was nothing he could do to fix what he had broken. However, the worst was yet to come. 2 weeks later, as Samuel was preparing for his Sunday sermon, he received a phone call that would change everything. It was the sheriff's office. They needed him to come down to the station immediately. Confused and nervous, Samuel drove to the sheriff's office, his mind racing. What could they want with him? When he arrived, Sheriff Robert Jenkins met him in the parking lot and let him inside. Reverend Carrington, Sheriff Jenkins began, his face grim. We need to talk. Samuel was taken aback. What's going on? We've got a situation, the sheriff said, leading him to an interrogation room. Your wife, Rachel, she's gone missing. The sheriff's words hit Samuel like a slap in the face. Gone missing? The phrase echoed in his mind as he sat down in the sterile, white-walled room. His hands, usually steady when delivering his sermons, trembled in his lap. The heat of panic began to creep up his neck. Sheriff, what do you mean missing? Samuel's voice cracked with confusion and a growing sense of dread. Rachel would never just disappear. She's upset with me, but she wouldn't leave. Sheriff Jenkins sat across from him, folding his arms over his chest, his face set in a solemn expression. It's not just that, Reverend. Rachel was last seen leaving her mother's house 2 days ago. No one has heard from her since. Her car is parked at her mother's house, and there's no sign of a struggle. But when we went through her things, we found some things that don't add up. Samuel's heart skipped a beat. What do you mean? His voice was barely above a whisper. Rachel's phone was found in the living room. Her purse was still there. But in the nightstand, we found a letter. It was addressed to you, Reverend, and it's not a letter of forgiveness. Sheriff Jenkins paused, watching Samuel carefully. Samuel felt his breath catch. He hadn't seen the letter. He didn't even know Rachel had written one. What had she said? What had she meant by it? His mind spiraled into a whirlpool of guilt and fear. He needed to know more. Can I see it? Samuel asked, his voice tight with anxiety. The sheriff nodded, standing up and walking to a file on the table. He handed Samuel the letter. As Samuel read the words, a cold wave of dread washed over him. Rachel's handwriting was clear and precise. It read, Samuel, I don't know what I expected from you, but it wasn't this. To think I gave you my trust, my love, only for you to betray me so horribly. I know everything, Samuel. Every little secret you've been keeping. I've seen the way you look at her, how you've been with my mother behind my back. But this isn't just about what you've done to me. It's about the man I thought I knew, the man I thought was better than this. I can't stay with you, Samuel. I can't live in a house with someone who's nothing but a stranger to me now. But there's one thing I've learned in all of this. I can't forgive you. Not now, not ever. Please don't try to find me. Goodbye. Rachel. Samuel's hand shook as he lowered the letter. His breath was shallow, his mind reeling. This wasn't just a note of anger. This was a goodbye, a permanent one. Do you think she might have just left on her own? Samuel asked, looking up at the sheriff. Sheriff Jenkins shook his head. I don't think so. If Rachel wanted to leave, she would have taken her things. She wouldn't have just left her purse and phone behind, and she wouldn't have written this letter unless she was in a state of mind to do something drastic. Samuel's thoughts raced, but before he could say anything more, the sheriff's phone rang. He answered quickly, his voice low and urgent. Yeah, we're on our way, right now. When he hung up, he looked back at Samuel with a troubled expression. We need to go to her mother's house, now. Rachel's mother's house was a modest home located on the outskirts of Cedar Grove, nestled between a row of trees. It was the kind of place that looked warm and inviting from the outside, but Samuel felt a sense of foreboding wash over him as he approached. Sheriff Jenkins led the way, and Samuel followed, his heart racing with every step. When they reached the door, the sheriff knocked, his fist connecting with the wood with a firm rap. Gladys Winters opened the door, her eyes bloodshot as if she hadn't slept in days. Her hands trembled as she greeted them. Sheriff, Reverend, she said softly, stepping aside to let them in. I don't know what to say. Mrs. Winters, we need to talk to you about Rachel, Sheriff Jenkins said, his voice kind but firm. Gladys nodded, closing the door behind them. She led them into the living room, where a familiar scene unfolded before Samuel. It was the same room where he had first been with her, where they had shared stolen moments that now seemed like a lifetime ago. But now everything felt different. The room felt colder, more suffocating, as though the walls themselves knew the truth. I don't know where she went, Sheriff, Gladys said, wringing her hands. I've tried calling. Her assistant, I just don't understand. Rachel? She was so angry. She, she found out about me and Samuel, didn't she? Sheriff Jenkins nodded slowly. It seems that way, and that's why we're concerned. Rachel has gone missing, and we need to find her, Mrs. Winters. Do you know if she left with anyone? Is there anyone who might have taken her? Gladys shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. I don't know. I didn't mean for this to happen, Sheriff. It was never supposed to go this far. Samuel stood frozen, unable to find words. Gladys' tears seemed real, but there was something off about the way she was acting. Something Samuel couldn't quite put his finger on. I think we need to search the property, Sheriff Jenkins said, cutting through the tension. You don't mind if we take a look around, do you? Gladys hesitated but nodded. No, go ahead. I just don't know what to do anymore. I never wanted any of this. As they searched the house, Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The house seemed too quiet, too still. There were no signs of a struggle, but then again, maybe that was the point. Maybe Rachel had left willingly, just not in the way they had expected. And then, in a small, dark room at the back of the house, Sheriff Jenkins found something that made Samuel's blood run cold. A blood-stained towel. The blood-stained towel lay in the corner of a small, dimly lit room, tucked away from view behind a stack of old boxes. Samuel's stomach lurched as he stared at it, his breath catching in his throat. The towel was soaked through, the crimson stain stark against the otherwise pristine white fabric. It was the kind of discovery that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. His heart raced, pounding in his ears, as he took a tentative step forward. Sheriff Jenkins crouched down beside the towel, his expression darkening. This wasn't here when we searched before, he muttered almost to himself. This is new. Samuel swallowed hard, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. His thoughts spun in a vicious circle, each one more disturbing than the last. Could Rachel have been hurt? Could this have been the reason she hadn't returned home? Sheriff, Samuel's voice trembled. What do we do now? Jenkins stood up, his face grim. We need to test this, Reverend. This could be evidence of a crime. I didn't do anything, Samuel said quickly, his hands instinctively reaching for the edge of the nearest chair to steady himself. His mind raced and the panic was starting to swell, threatening to break the surface of his carefully constructed facade. I'm not saying you did, Jenkins said, his voice calm, though his eyes held an edge of suspicion. But we need to get this towel processed, and we need to keep searching. Something's not right here, and we need to figure out what happened to Rachel. Gladys, who had been standing off to the side, wringing her hands in distress, took a step forward. Please, Sheriff, you've got to believe me, she said, her voice choked with emotion. I didn't hurt my daughter. I loved her. I never meant for any of this to happen. This affair, it was a mistake, but I never wanted anything bad to happen to Rachel. The sheriff didn't respond right away. Instead, he pulled out his phone and dialed a number, speaking briefly to someone on the other end. Samuel, meanwhile, could feel the room closing in on him. The evidence was mounting, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could keep his composure. Reverend, Sheriff Jenkins said, looking up from his phone, I need you to come with me to the station. We need to take a closer look at everything. There's a lot more here than meets the eye. Samuel's heart skipped a beat. What do you mean? His voice was a mixture of confusion and dread. He knew things were bad, but he didn't understand why the sheriff was so sure that there was more to this. Everything's connected, Reverend, Jenkins replied, his voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of something darker. Rachel's disappearance, the affair, the blood-stained towel. It's all starting to point to something much worse than just a broken marriage. The drive to the sheriff's office felt interminable. Every passing mile seemed to stretch on forever, the silence in the car pressing down on Samuel like a heavy weight. He kept his hands tightly gripped to the edges of the seat, trying to steady his nerves. He didn't know what to expect next, but one thing was clear. His life was unraveling faster than he could process it. Sheriff Jenkins didn't say anything on the drive. He kept his eyes on the road, his jaw clenched. Samuel tried to read him, but the sheriff was an enigma. his thoughts hidden behind a stoic exterior. When they arrived at the station, Samuel was ushered into a small, sterile interrogation room. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the sharp smell of cleaning chemicals stung his nose. A table sat in the center of the room, flanked by two chairs. Samuel sat down across from Jenkins, who placed a manila folder on the table and slid it toward him. "This," the sheriff said, his tone hardening, "is why we need to talk." Samuel hesitated before opening the folder. Inside, there were several photographs. The first one was of the blood-stained towel they had found in Gladys's house. The next photograph made Samuel's blood run cold. It was a close-up of a single drop of blood that had been found on the floor just outside the room where the towel was discovered. There was something about the angle of the drop, the way it was placed, that made Samuel feel as though it wasn't an accident. "Rachel's blood," the sheriff said, his voice grim. "We found traces of it in that room. And there's more." Samuel looked up at the sheriff, his face pale. "What do you mean there's more?" Jenkins flipped through the folder, revealing more photographs. These were of Rachel's car, her white sedan parked in front of Gladys's house. But one photograph stood out among the rest. It was taken from an angle that showed the trunk of the car, slightly open. And inside the trunk, partially obscured by a blanket, was a large suitcase. "That suitcase was found in Rachel's car," Jenkins said, leaning forward. "We found traces of blood on the inside of it. It looks like someone tried to hide something. And it wasn't just Rachel's blood." Samuel's heart raced in his chest. "What are you trying to say, Sheriff?" Jenkins looked Samuel dead in the eye. "We think Rachel was hurt. We think she was put in that trunk. And we think she's dead." Samuel recoiled, his mind reeling. He couldn't process what he was hearing. Dead? No. This couldn't be happening. He had never meant for any of this to escalate this far. It was supposed to have been a secret, a brief affair that no one would ever find out about. He never imagined that it would lead to something like this. "We need your full cooperation, Reverend," Jenkins continued. "Tell me what happened. What was the last time you saw Rachel?" Samuel opened his mouth, but no words came. His mind was blank. He couldn't speak. The weight of the accusation was suffocating, and he felt trapped, like a man drowning in quicksand, sinking deeper with every passing second. Finally, after a long pause, Samuel managed to find his voice. I didn't mean for this to happen," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I never meant for Rachel to get hurt. I loved her. But I made a terrible mistake. I'm sorry." Sheriff Jenkins didn't respond immediately. He simply stared at Samuel, as if measuring him, before asking the question that Samuel had been dreading. "Did you kill her, Reverend?" The air in the interrogation room felt thick, almost suffocating. Samuel's chest tightened, each breath coming in shallow bursts as Sheriff Jenkins' question hung heavily in the air. The question was simple, but the weight of it bore down on him like a crushing force. "Did you kill her, Reverend?" For a long moment, Samuel said nothing. He could hear his pulse pounding in his ears, the sound deafening in the quiet room. His thoughts were scattered, fragmented, like shattered glass that couldn't be pieced back together. How had he gotten here? How had it all gone so terribly wrong? The affair with Gladys had started as something simple, something harmless, or so he had convinced himself. A moment of weakness, an escape from the weight of his duties as a preacher, a way to feel alive again. It had been a mistake, but he had never thought it would end like this. He never thought it would lead to Rachel's disappearance, or worse, her death. He looked up at the sheriff, his eyes filled with confusion, guilt, and something darker. Fear. The fear that the truth once spoken could never be taken back. I don't know," Samuel muttered, his voice low, cracking with emotion. "I didn't want any of this. I never meant for it to go this far." Sheriff Jenkins leaned forward, his gaze never leaving Samuel. "You need to tell me what happened, Reverend. All of it. We know you've been lying to us. It's time to come clean. For Rachel's sake." The words hit Samuel like a slap in the face. For Rachel's sake. He had failed her. He had failed to protect the one person who had trusted him with her heart, and now it seemed like there was no way to make it right. I was with her," Samuel finally said, his voice trembling as he spoke the words aloud for the first time. "Gladys. We were having an affair for months. I don't know what I was thinking. I don't know how it started, but it happened. And Rachel, she found out. She knew. Sheriff Jenkins nodded, not interrupting. He let Samuel speak, his silence encouraging the preacher to continue, to unravel the tangled web of lies that had ensnared him. I don't know how Rachel found out, but she did. She confronted me, and we fought. I didn't want to hurt her, Sheriff, but she was so angry. She, she said she was going to leave. She said she couldn't be with a man who had betrayed her like that. Samuel's voice broke, and he wiped a tear from his cheek. I begged her to stay. I told her I'd end things with Gladys, but she wouldn't listen. She said it was too late. Jenkins listened intently, his expression unreadable. Go on, he urged quietly. I didn't know what to do, Samuel said, his eyes clouded with a mix of regret and confusion. I kept telling her that I'd fix everything, that I'd make it right, but she wouldn't believe me. She started to leave, but when she did, she slipped. She fell. She hit her head on the corner of the coffee table. Samuel's voice cracked as the memory resurfaced, raw and painful. I tried to help her, but she was unconscious. I didn't know what to do. I panicked. I, I didn't want to be the cause of her death. I didn't mean to hurt her. Sheriff Jenkins remained quiet, watching him closely. Samuel could feel the weight of the sheriff's gaze, like he was being stripped bare, his soul laid open for judgment. So what happened after that? Jenkins finally asked, his voice steady, though his eyes were filled with something darker, an understanding of the danger Samuel had put himself in. I thought she was dead, Samuel whispered. I thought I had killed her. So I wrapped her in a blanket. I couldn't leave her there, Sheriff. I couldn't face what I had done. I didn't know what to do. I panicked. Samuel's breath was ragged now, his chest heaving with the weight of his confession. I put her in the trunk of her car. I drove it out to the woods near the creek. I thought I could get rid of everything, make it disappear. Sheriff Jenkins didn't say anything, but his gaze sharpened. He was listening closely now, watching for any sign that Samuel was lying. I parked the car by the creek, Samuel continued, his voice hollow. I opened the trunk and I looked at her. I thought maybe she was still alive, that I could call for help. But when I checked, she was cold. Her skin was pale. She was gone. Tears were streaming down Samuel's face now, but he didn't try to wipe them away. He was past that. All that mattered now was the truth, the awful truth that had been buried under his guilt for so long. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't just leave her there, Sheriff. I had to make it look like she ran away. So I took her phone, her purse, and I left them at her mother's house. I thought if I made it look like she had just left on her own, no one would know the truth. Samuel's voice broke once more, and he buried his face in his hands, sobbing uncontrollably. The weight of his actions crushed him. He had killed his wife, not with a weapon, but with his betrayal, his lies, and his desperate attempt to cover up what he had done. The sheriff let him cry for a moment, but when he spoke, his voice was calm, though there was a trace of sadness in it. Reverend, this won't end with just a confession. We'll need to find Rachel to confirm everything you've told us. And even if what you're saying is true, you've still committed a crime. You've taken a life, even if it wasn't intentional. Samuel looked up, his eyes red and swollen from the tears. I didn't mean to kill her, I swear, but I know that doesn't change anything. I deserve whatever happens now. I just wanted her to be happy. I wanted to be a better man for her. Sheriff Jenkins sat back in his chair, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. We'll see about that, Reverend. Right now, we need to find Rachel's body and make sure we have all the evidence we need to bring closure to this case. But one thing's clear. You're not getting out of this one. Samuel nodded slowly, his gaze falling to the table in front of him. He had no idea what would happen next. He had confessed, but even that wouldn't be enough to atone for the life he had taken. All he could do now was wait for the consequences to catch up with him. The morning light was slow to break over the sleepy Texas town of Clayton, casting long, pale shadows over the hills. The sheriff's office was already buzzing with activity. The investigation into Rachel's disappearance had taken a dark turn, And it was clear to everyone involved that this case was no longer just about a missing person. It was about finding a body and finding the truth. Sheriff Jenkins was sitting at his desk, his hands folded neatly in front of him. He glanced over at Deputy Carla Monroe, who was on the phone with a forensics team. The tension in the air was palpable. Every minute seemed to stretch on forever. "Anything yet?" Jenkins asked, his voice steady but tired. The weight of the case had already begun to wear on him, and it was only getting heavier. "Still waiting on the search teams," Carla replied, hanging up the phone. "They're combing the woods by the creek now. They found Rachel's car, and they're trying to get a positive ID on the body. But it's not going to be easy." Jenkins sighed, rubbing his temples. "Let's hope for a break soon. We need to end this, one way or another." Across town, Samuel sat in the small holding cell, his mind a chaotic swirl of guilt, fear, and regret. The words he had spoken the night before echoed in his mind like a constant hum. "I didn't mean to kill her. I swear I didn't." But the damage was done. His confession had set everything in motion, and now there was no turning back. He had expected to feel a sense of relief after finally confessing, but instead the weight on his chest only grew heavier. His thoughts kept returning to that night, to the moment Rachel had fallen, to the way her lifeless body had felt when he had checked for a pulse. He couldn't shake the image from his mind. Her cold, pale skin, the vacant look in her eyes. It haunted him. And then there was Gladys. His heart twisted painfully at the thought of her. She had been the one person who had understood him, who had given him the comfort he had been seeking for so long. But now their secret was exposed. She had been a part of this too, whether she liked it or not. She had to know what had happened to Rachel. Whether she was involved in Rachel's death or not, her silence had been complicit. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway, pulling Samuel out of his thoughts. The door to his cell creaked open, and Deputy Carla Monroe stepped inside. "Reverend," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. "Sheriff Jenkins wants to talk to you again. We found Rachel's body." Samuel's stomach dropped at the words. They found her. He stood slowly, his knees feeling weak. The reality of what was happening crashed into him all at once, and he felt the floor shift beneath him. He had thought that confessing was the hardest part, but now it felt like the worst was yet to come. What would happen now? What would they do with him? Carla led him down the hallway and Samuel followed, his feet heavy as he walked toward the sheriff's office. His mind spun and his heart pounded in his chest. He wasn't sure if he was ready to face the consequences of his actions, but he knew he had no choice. When they reached the sheriff's office, Sheriff Jenkins was standing by the window, staring out at the sun rising over the town. He turned when he heard the door open, his eyes locking onto Samuel's. "Have a seat," Jenkins said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. Samuel sat, his hands trembling in his lap. He couldn't meet the sheriff's gaze. Not now. Not after everything that had been revealed. "I've been informed that they found Rachel's body," Jenkins began, his tone even but carrying the weight of what had transpired. "It was in the creek, just like you said. The car was parked nearby, and it didn't take long for the search teams to find her." Samuel nodded, the lump in his throat growing larger. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. His chest felt tight, and all he could do was sit there, waiting for whatever would come next. "The thing is, Reverend," Jenkins continued, "they found something else in the creek. Something that doesn't add up. We didn't just find Rachel's body, we found evidence of foul play." Samuel's breath hitched. "Evidence of foul play?" The sheriff leaned forward, his eyes sharp. "You told us last night that Rachel fell and hit her head. That's what you said happened, right?" Samuel nodded again, his throat dry. "Yes, that's what happened." Jenkins didn't look convinced. "You didn't mention anything about a knife, Reverend." "A knife?" Samuel's blood ran cold. His mind reeled as he tried to process what the sheriff was saying. "We found a knife near Rachel's body," Jenkins said, his voice growing more intense. "It was lodged in her side, deep enough to cause significant damage. The knife was coated in her blood. Now tell me, Reverend, how does a knife end up in her side if she simply fell?" Samuel opened his mouth, but no words came out. His mind was spinning, and for a moment he felt like he was falling through a hole, unable to catch himself. How had this happened? He had not hurt her with a knife. He had not meant for any of this to happen. But now there was evidence suggesting otherwise. Jenkins watched him carefully. Did someone else have a hand in this, Reverend? Did someone else kill Rachel? Samuel shook his head desperately. No, I swear. I didn't kill her with a knife. I didn't know about the knife. I didn't do it, Sheriff. The sheriff paused for a moment, his expression hardening. Then explain it to me, Reverend. You're the only one who knows what really happened. If someone else was involved, we need to know. Right now, you're the prime suspect. Still be a chance to make this right. Samuel's head was spinning. He couldn't deny what had happened, but there were pieces to this puzzle that didn't fit. Someone else had to be involved. But who? And how? I didn't do it, Samuel said again, his voice trembling. I swear, I didn't know about the knife, but I don't know who did this. I don't know how it happened, but it wasn't just me. I didn't kill her. Sheriff Jenkins leaned back in his chair, watching him closely. Then we'll find out who did. And when we do, we'll be back here. And I hope for your sake, Reverend, that you're not lying to me now. Because if you are, this will get a whole lot worse. The investigation had taken another unexpected turn. The presence of the knife was troubling, to say the least. It contradicted everything Samuel had said. His confession, albeit flawed and incomplete, had painted a picture of an accidental death, an unintentional tragedy. But the discovery of the weapon and the brutality with which it had been used raised serious questions. Who could have murdered Rachel, and why? Sheriff Jenkins had spent the past few hours on the phone with the forensic team, piecing together what little evidence they had. The body had been retrieved from the creek and sent to the morgue for an autopsy. The knife, coated in Rachel's blood, had been placed in a plastic evidence bag. It wasn't a kitchen knife, no. It was a blade that looked like it had been carried with intent, a tactical, jagged edge. Whoever had used it had done so with purpose. Samuel had insisted that he hadn't known about the knife, but Jenkins wasn't convinced. The evidence suggested that Rachel had been stabbed before she had fallen. The force of the wound indicated a deliberate attack, not an accidental injury. The sheriff's office was buzzing with activity as the team sifted through the new evidence. The weight of the case pressed down on everyone, but Jenkins remained resolute. He knew that in order to find the truth, they needed to dig deeper. The only way to uncover what had really happened was to follow the threads wherever they led, no matter how uncomfortable the journey might be. At the morgue, the coroner, Dr. Helen Briggs, had finished her initial examination of Rachel's body. Her face was grim as she reviewed the evidence. "Sheriff, you were right to bring me in on this one," Dr. Briggs said, her voice cold but authoritative. "The stab wound is clearly the cause of death. But there's something else, something you need to know." Jenkins raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" "There's a defensive wound on her left hand," Dr. Briggs continued. "It looks like she tried to fight off her attacker, but the blade was just too much. She put up a struggle before she died." Jenkins nodded. "So she wasn't killed by accident. This wasn't a simple fall." "No, Sheriff. This was murder." The word hung in the air between them. Murder. The ugly truth of it settled in, and the sheriff's gut twisted with the implications. It wasn't just a tragedy now. It was something more sinister. But who had done this, and why? "I'll get the full report back to you later today," Dr. Briggs added, turning back to the body on the table. "But for now, I can say with certainty, this wasn't an accident, and it wasn't Samuel Turner's doing alone." Back at the sheriff's office, Jenkins gathered his team for a meeting. He had already sent for Gladys, Rachel's mother, and Samuel's wife, Carol, but they would need to piece together the full picture before they could move forward. Everyone had a part to play, whether they knew it or not. Sheriff Jenkins paced the room, looking out the window toward the small, quiet town of Clayton. It seemed like such an ordinary place, a place where nothing too terrible could ever happen. But here they were, dealing with a murder that was tied to lies, secrets, and betrayal. No one was innocent anymore. "All right," Jenkins began, looking at his team. "We know Rachel was murdered, we know she put up a fight, and we know the knife was used deliberately. But Samuel Turner swears he didn't do it, and I'm not sure I buy his story about everything being an accident." He paused, watching his deputies as they absorbed the information. We need to dig into everyone's background. Gladys, Carol, Samuel, all of them. We need to find out if anyone else had a motive. Deputy Carla Monroe spoke up. Sheriff, what about Gladys? She was Rachel's mother, but she was also involved with Samuel, right? That could give her a motive. Jenkins nodded. Exactly. Gladys was close to Rachel, and we know she and Samuel were having an affair. That means she has a lot to lose if this whole thing comes to light. We need to find out what role she played in all of this. Another deputy, Mark Duran, looked at the sheriff with concern. What about Carol, Samuel's wife? Could she have been involved? I mean, we know she's been under a lot of pressure recently, dealing with her husband's affair. She might have snapped. Jenkins considered this. It's possible, but we don't have enough on Carol yet. We need to talk to her and get her side of the story. But right now, all roads lead back to Gladys and Samuel. We'll start with her. If anyone knows the truth, it's her. Gladys sat in the small, sterile interrogation room, her hands folded neatly on the table in front of her. She looked calm, almost composed, but there was a tremor in her eyes, a fear that couldn't quite be hidden. She knew why she was here. She had known this day was coming ever since Rachel had confronted her about the affair. Sheriff Jenkins sat across from her, his eyes hard and focused. Gladys, we know you were involved with Samuel Turner. You need to tell me the truth. What happened to Rachel? Her lips trembled and she lowered her gaze to the table. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I never wanted Rachel to die. I loved her like a daughter. Jenkins leaned forward, his voice low. I don't believe you. You had an affair with Samuel, and when Rachel found out, she confronted you both. Did she threaten to tell everyone? Did you and Samuel kill her to keep your secret safe? Gladys flinched at the accusation. No, we didn't kill her. I didn't want that to happen. It was all Samuel's fault. Jenkins narrowed his eyes. Samuel's fault? You're telling me Samuel killed Rachel, and you had nothing to do with it? Gladys's face twisted with grief. I love Samuel, but when Rachel found out about us, she went crazy. She threatened to expose everything. Her husband, the church, our lives. She said she was going to make sure everyone knew what we'd done. She was out of control. And you didn't try to stop her? You didn't think maybe you could handle the situation without someone getting hurt? Gladys looked up at the sheriff, her eyes desperate. I didn't know what to do. I told Samuel we should end the affair. But Rachel, she wouldn't listen. She was so angry. She threatened to leave him. And that's when things went too far. Jenkins stared at her, waiting for her to say more. The room felt heavy with her silence. Gladys had just admitted her part in the affair, but now it seemed she was trying to distance herself from the murder. Gladys, the sheriff said softly, we're getting closer to the truth, and you're going to have to choose whether or not you want to be part of that truth. The sun was setting, casting a red-orange hue over the horizon as Sheriff Jenkins sat alone in his office. The weight of the case hung heavy on his shoulders, and his mind raced with the pieces that had yet to fall into place. Gladys's confession had provided some clarity, but there was still something missing, something that didn't add up. He had spent hours reviewing the statements, the evidence, and the interviews. The knife, the defensive wounds, Rachel's struggle, everything pointed to one thing, murder. But who had truly pulled the trigger? Was it Samuel? Was it Gladys? Or was there someone else behind this twisted web of lies and betrayal? Sheriff Jenkins was not one to be swayed by emotions, but this case had gnawed at him. He needed answers. He needed closure. For Rachel, for her family, and for the town of Clayton, which had been torn apart by the death of one of its most beloved residents. It was nearly midnight when the phone rang in the sheriff's office. Jenkins picked it up, his fingers brushing against the cold receiver. Sheriff Jenkins, he answered, his voice steady but fatigued. Sheriff, it's Carla. We've got something big. Jenkins straightened, his heart quickening. What is it? We ran a full background check on Samuel Turner and his wife Carol. Turns out Carol wasn't just sitting idly by while all this was happening. She had her suspicions about the affair long before Rachel confronted her. Jenkins' brow furrowed. What are you talking about? Carla's voice dropped to a whisper. We found out that Carol had hired a private investigator. She knew about Samuel and Gladys long before Rachel did. She was planning to confront them, But when Rachel found out first, Carol snapped. She wasn't just upset, she was furious. And we've got a statement from the PI who was tailing Samuel and Gladys. He saw them together the night of Rachel's death. But that's not all. There's something else. Jenkins's pulse quickened. What else? Carol had access to Samuel's gun. She was the one who planted it in the creek. The realization hit like a thunderclap. All the signs had been there, but the pieces had been scattered across the board, too far apart for anyone to see the full picture. Carol Turner had been the catalyst for everything. She had known about the affair. She had known about Samuel and Gladys's secret long before Rachel had, but it wasn't just jealousy or betrayal that had driven her to the edge. It was something far darker. Carol had been protecting her reputation, but in doing so, she had pushed her husband and mother-in-law into a deadly confrontation. She had never intended for Rachel to be the one to die, but in the midst of her rage, she had inadvertently sealed Rachel's fate. Jenkins leaned back in his chair, letting the silence settle around him. The truth was ugly, but it was clear now. Carol's guilt had been hidden behind a mask of grief, her outward show of vulnerability, a shield to protect her from suspicion. She had been playing the victim all along, making everyone think she was the innocent wife who had been betrayed by her husband. But in reality, she had been just as complicit in Rachel's death as Samuel and Gladys. The next morning, Jenkins gathered his team for one last round of questioning. They had enough to make an arrest now. Gladys had been a willing participant in the affair, but she had never intended to kill Rachel. Samuel, while guilty of his infidelity, had acted impulsively in a moment of panic, but he hadn't meant to murder his wife. The real mastermind behind it all was Carol. They brought her into the sheriff's office for questioning. Carol entered the room, her face pale and drawn, her eyes swollen from tears she had likely been crying all night. But Jenkins could see past the facade. He could see the guilt lurking behind her eyes. She knew what was coming. "Carol," Jenkins began, his voice calm but firm, "we know what you did." Carol looked up at him, her hands trembling slightly. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice weak, almost pleading. "I'm not going to pretend like I don't know what happened," Jenkins replied, his tone steady. "We've spoken to Gladys. We've spoken to Samuel. And we know you hired a private investigator to track your husband's movements long before Rachel ever found out. You knew about the affair. You knew everything. And we know you were the one who planted the gun in the creek." Carol's face paled even further, her lips trembling as she opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. For a long moment, she just stared at him, as if trying to deny it, but Jenkins could see the truth in her eyes. "Why did you do it?" Jenkins pressed. "Why go this far? Why kill Rachel?" Tears welled up in Carol's eyes. "I didn't mean to. I never meant for any of this to happen. Everything was falling apart. My marriage, my family. I felt like I was losing everything. Samuel didn't love me anymore. He loved her. Gladys had taken him from me, and when Rachel found out, I couldn't let her ruin my life too." Jenkins's gaze softened, but only for a moment. "So you killed your own daughter-in-law to protect your secret, to protect yourself." "I didn't kill her. Not on purpose," Carol sobbed. "It just happened. Rachel was going to tell everyone. She was going to destroy everything, and I couldn't let that happen." Jenkins shook his head. "You didn't just protect yourself, Carol. You murdered her to cover up your shame." Carol's shoulders sagged, and for a brief moment, she seemed like a broken woman, shattered by the weight of her own guilt. Her tears flowed freely, and she finally whispered, "I didn't mean for it to end like this. I just wanted to keep my family together." In the end, Carol Turner was arrested for the murder of Rachel Turner. Samuel and Gladys, while complicit in the affair, were not directly involved in Rachel's death. But the damage had been done. The affair, the lies, and the betrayal had set a chain of events into motion that had ended in tragedy. Clayton, Texas, would never be the same. The truth had been uncovered, but at what cost? Lives had been ruined, families torn apart, and a young woman's life had been senselessly taken. As Sheriff Jenkins walked out of the interrogation room, he couldn't help but wonder, how many more secrets would the town of Clayton hold? And how many more lives would be lost before the truth finally came to light?